little bit of a character. It's not the way that we normally view hospitals. It's viewed in a positive way because for a lot of people that have cystic fibrosis and other
Oh my goodness, Blake Lively seems to have more money than she knows what to do with. Hey everyone, welcome to Popcorn Planet. I'm Kim, and I'm joined by Andy, who's currently traveling. It's good to see you. I'm actually coming to you from my mom's gourd garage. Yes, really. So quick shout out, check out her site at gourd.com and support her amazing work. I had to plug her because she's the best. But we had to talk about this headline because it's honestly hard to wrap your head around. During what was supposed to be a serious and high-pressure court mediation, instead of something important like legal documents arriving, a chauffeur reportedly showed up delivering a $500 Mahjong set directly to Blake Lively. This wasn't just any casual setting either. This was a room filled with high-powered attorneys, the kind who charge upwards of $1,000 an hour, all gathered with the sole purpose of working through a complex legal dispute and pushing toward a resolution. Every minute in that room carries weight, not just financially but strategically, as both sides try to navigate a tense situation that likely has major consequences. And yet, in the middle of all that intensity, this unexpected and frankly bizarre delivery became the focal point. According to reports, after only a few hours into the mediation, she appeared disengaged, as if the seriousness of the proceedings wasn't enough to hold her attention, and instead turned towards something as trivial as a game set. Whether that perception is entirely fair or not, the optics of the situation are what really drove the reaction. To outside observers, it came across as dismissive, almost as if the legal process itself could be paused or sidelined for personal amusement. In a context where every participant is expected to be fully present, focused, and respectful of the time and effort being invested, this moment stood out sharply. That single incident quickly ignited a wave of criticism, with many people pointing to it as a clear example of privilege and detachment. It reinforced an existing narrative that she can come across as out of touch, a label that has surfaced in previous discussions about her public image. Moments like this tend to amplify those perceptions, especially when they happen in such a high-stakes and visible environment. People weren't just reacting to the action itself, but to what it symbolized: the gap between someone in a position of wealth and influence and the expectations of accountability and seriousness in a legal setting. Andy, jumping back in, thanks again for joining while you're with your parents, but seriously, I can't get over it either. Out of touch really does seem to be the key phrase people keep coming back to. And situations like this only seem to reinforce that narrative. And when you really stop and think about the sheer cost of something like this, it becomes even more You've got multiple senior lawyers sitting in that room, each billing at incredibly high hourly rates, potentially costing tens of thousands of dollars for just a few hours of discussion. That's an enormous amount of money being spent in real time, all centered around resolving something important. Imagine being in that kind of environment, everyone focused, serious, and working under pressure, and then witnessing a moment like that unfold. It just adds a surreal, almost unbelievable layer to an already intense situation. This was far from a casual meeting. It was a tense and significant moment in a complex legal dispute where every minute carried real weight, both strategically and financially. In that kind of environment, the expectation is intense focus, structured negotiation, and careful, deliberate discussion aimed at reaching some form of resolution. These sessions are typically slow-moving by nature, with mediators going back and forth between parties, but they require patience and full engagement from everyone involved. However, according to accounts being circulated, there was a moment where attention briefly shifted away from the legal arguments due to an unexpected personal distraction entering the room. For some observers, this interruption felt disruptive, breaking the flow of what should have been a highly focused process, while others viewed it as a relatively minor pause in an otherwise routine, though high-pressure mediation setting. When you really think about the setup, it almost sounds surreal. Imagine sitting in a settlement room surrounded by 10 high-level attorneys, each likely charging around $1,000 an hour or even more. That means every single hour costs an enormous amount of money, potentially tens of thousands altogether, just to have everyone present and working through the case. And in the middle of that, the idea, at least as critics framed it, that someone might feel bored enough to call in a chauffeur and request a $500 Mahjong set starts to sound almost unbelievable. It raises questions about priorities and how seriously the moment is being taken. Critics leaned into that image, painting a picture of someone stepping away mentally from the situation, as if the gravity of the legal proceedings wasn't enough to hold their full attention. For those unfamiliar with the story, reports most notably from Page 6 claimed that Blake Lively arrived early, around 8:30 a.m., ahead of mediation discussions that were expected to begin later in the morning. By approximately 11 a.m., just a few hours into the process, she was reportedly already feeling restless as the proceedings moved at the slow, methodical pace typical of legal negotiations. Observers noted that this timing stood out, given how high stakes and consequential such mediations tend to be. Normally, individuals involved in disputes of this magnitude are expected to remain fully engaged throughout, using every moment to consult with their legal team, refine arguments, or strategize next steps instead. This account suggested a shift in focus, with reports claiming she sought out a distraction rather than staying immersed in the process. The detail that captured the most attention was the reported request for a Mahjong set. Not just any simple diversion like a deck of cards or a crossword puzzle, but a set valued at around $500. That specific detail quickly became a focal point in public discussions, as it added a layer of perceived extravagance to the situation. For critics, it wasn't merely about playing a game, it symbolized bringing a luxury item into a setting that is usually defined by seriousness, discipline, and restraint. The price itself became part of the narrative, with people contrasting it against the already immense cost of the legal proceedings. In that framing, what might have been a private moment of distraction was transformed into a public talking point, fueling broader debates about image, privilege, and perception. There were also practical questions people raised. Courtrooms and mediation spaces often have strict rules about what can and cannot be brought in, so some found it unusual or confusing that something like this would even be allowed. Others focused on the logistics. Mahjong is typically played with 3 or 4 people, so who exactly would have been playing? Would that mean pulling attention away from legal work, effectively pausing the very discussions those high-priest lawyers were there to handle? That idea added another layer to the criticism, with some suggesting it could be seen as counterproductive, especially given the cost and importance of the time being spent. Reactions online reflected a mix of disbelief, criticism, and sarcasm. Some commenters interpreted the situation as a sign of disengagement, arguing that appearing bored during such an important legal proceeding spoke volumes. Others questioned the practicality and appropriateness of the situation altogether. At the same time, there were those who downplayed it, suggesting it might simply have been a way to pass time during inevitable delays in a long drawn-out process. Still, the broader takeaway for many was hard to ignore. In a room filled with legal experts, where countless critical discussions could be happening, the idea of shifting focus to a game of briefly struck people as odd. Ultimately, whether viewed as a minor moment blown out of proportion or a genuine lapse in judgment, the incident became a powerful piece of the larger narrative surrounding the case. It highlighted how even small actions, when placed under public scrutiny in high-profile situations, can take on outsized meaning, especially when they intersect with themes like wealth, attention, and perceived seriousness. Hey, let's play Mahjong. That idea, whether taken literally or symbolically, ended up becoming a focal point in a much larger conversation. For many critics, this incident wasn't viewed as a one-off mistake, but rather as something that seemed to reinforce an existing narrative about Blake Lively's public image. Over the years, she has faced periodic criticism for appearing out of touch or at times insensitive in certain situations, and moments like this tend to bring those conversations back to the surface. In that context, the widely discussed mediation incident quickly turned into another flashpoint in an ongoing debate about perception, privilege, and how celebrities navigate serious situations under public scrutiny. Of course, not everyone interpreted the moment the same way. Supporters argued that mediation sessions can be long, drawn out, and filled with waiting periods, where brief distractions aren't unusual. But among detractors, the optics were difficult to ignore. The idea of requesting a $500 Mahjong set during a legal proceeding, especially one involving significant stakes, was seen as tone-deaf when compared to the seriousness of the environment. It wasn't just about the action itself, but what it appeared to represent, a disconnect between the gravity of the situation and the behavior displayed within it. Andy's frustration reflects what a lot of critics have been saying. One of the most consistent criticisms directed at Lively has been this perception of being out of touch, and headlines like this only seem to reinforce that idea in the eyes of those already skeptical. When you combine this with past controversies, whether related to marketing decisions, public comments, or other high-profile moments, it creates a pattern that people latch onto. That's why reactions were so immediate and intense, especially on social media, where commentary quickly escalated from discussing the specific incident to making broader judgments about her character and behavior. The financial aspect only adds another layer to the criticism. Mediation at this level is incredibly expensive, with teams of lawyers, mediators, and legal staff all billing significant hourly rates. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars potentially being spent in a single day. In that kind of setting, every moment is supposed to be used productively, consulting with attorneys, refining strategy, negotiating terms. So when people imagine that time being interrupted, even briefly, by something like a game, it creates a jarring contrast that fuels the perception of wastefulness or lack of seriousness. There were also practical questions that made the situation seem even more unusual. Mahjong isn't typically a solo activity, it's designed for multiple players, so naturally people wondered who was actually supposed to participate. Would her legal team be expected to step away from their work? Was it simply meant as a personal distraction during downtime? These unanswered questions contributed to an almost absurd image in the minds of critics, making the story spread even faster and take on a life of its own. At the center of all this is the power of perception. In high-stakes legal environments, appearances matter just as much as actions. Mediation requires focus, patience, and a willingness to engage seriously in negotiation, especially when the outcome can have major financial and reputational consequences. Reports suggesting that she became restless early in the process and sought entertainment added to the narrative that she may not have been fully engaged. Whether that was truly the case or not, the broader discussion also touched on surrounding factors, like the absence of Ryan Reynolds from the mediation, which some observers interpreted as noteworthy, while that detail alone doesn't necessarily mean much. In combination with everything else, it fed into speculation and differing interpretations about the situation. In high-profile cases like this, even small details can shape public perception in significant ways. Ultimately, this moment became less about the Mahjong set itself and more about what it symbolized to different audiences. For critics, it reinforced existing concerns about privilege and disconnect. For others, it may have been an overblown reaction to a brief and possibly misunderstood moment during a long, tedious process. But either way, it highlights how quickly narratives can form and solidify when public figures are involved in serious, highly visible situations. The broader legal narrative surrounding the situation emphasized a key reality of mediation. It depends heavily on active participation, compromise, and sustained engagement from all parties involved. When that engagement appears to falter even briefly, it can raise concerns about whether progress is being made or if tensions might instead escalate, prolonging the dispute. As weeks of coverage unfolded, particularly from entertainment-focused outlets, the story began to shift away from strictly legal details and towards something more interpretive, focusing on behavior, optics, and perceived professionalism within the mediation room. Each new report or anecdote added another layer, gradually building a public narrative that extended far beyond the original context of the proceedings themselves. As the story spread online, it reached a much wider audience, where discussions became increasingly polarized. For some, the incident symbolized a broader issue tied to celebrity culture, specifically how wealth and status can influence not just behavior, but how that behavior is perceived. Critics argued that visible displays of affluence, especially in serious legal environments, can unintentionally shape public opinion, even if they have no direct impact on the legal outcome. On the other hand, supporters pushed back, pointing out that mediation can be mentally exhausting and unpredictable, and that individuals cope with stress in different ways. From that perspective, focusing too heavily on a single reported moment risks oversimplifying a much more complex situation. Legal professionals also weighed in, noting that mediation environments are rarely as straightforward as they might appear from the outside. There are often long periods of waiting, indirect communication through mediators, and strategic pauses that can make the process feel slow or disjointed. Because of this, outward behavior doesn't always reflect what's happening behind the scenes in terms of legal strategy or intent. Still, in high-profile cases, especially those involving celebrities, public perception tends to fill in those gaps, often without access to the full picture. What made this situation particularly notable was how quickly it transformed from a single, reported incident into a much larger cultural conversation. Public fascination with celebrity legal battles meant that even minor details were amplified, dissected, and shared repeatedly across platforms. The discussion began to center not just on what happened, but on what it seemed to represent: a perceived imbalance between wealth, influence, and expected courtroom conduct. References to past controversies involving luxury or public image further reinforced this narrative for critics, creating a cumulative effect that shaped how the incident was interpreted. Analysts observing the situation pointed out that high-profile legal disputes often function as symbolic battlegrounds, where perception can carry nearly as much weight as the legal arguments themselves, at least in the court of public opinion. Within that framework, even small or ambiguous actions can take on outsized meaning, especially when filtered through media framing and audience bias. Social media, in particular, accelerates this process, allowing narratives to spread rapidly and evolve in real time, often becoming detached from their original context. Over time, the incident became less about the specific action and more about the narrative it supported. Some observers argued that the symbolism attached to the Mahjong set ultimately overshadowed the actual legal discussions taking place, turning a procedural moment into a cultural talking point. This highlights how interpretations of behavior can vary dramatically depending on context, perspective, and existing opinions about the individual involved. In environments shaped by wealth and celebrity, even neutral or minor actions can become heavily scrutinized and, at times, politicized. Legal experts also noted that while courtroom or mediation behavior typically doesn't factor into formal legal judgments, it can still influence broader perceptions among the public and media. Once those perceptions take hold, they can be difficult to reverse, even if additional context emerges later. Media coverage of celebrity disputes often prioritizes compelling narratives over detailed legal analysis, which can further skew public understanding of what's actually at stake. Within the entertainment industry, this creates an increasingly complex landscape for reputation management. The speed and reach of digital platforms mean that public sentiment can shift quickly, and once a particular narrative gains traction, it tends to reinforce itself through repetition. Each new discussion, headline, or social media post adds another layer, making it harder to separate perception from fact over time. Ultimately, this situation reflects the intersection of several powerful forces: celebrity culture, legal proceedings, media amplification, and public judgment. In such an environment, symbolism often outweighs substance, and perception can shape long-term reputational outcomes more than any single rarefied detail. The Mahjong incident, as framed by critics, became less about a specific moment and more about a broader story being told, one centered on privilege, engagement, and public image. What this case demonstrates most clearly is how quickly perception can become reality in modern